Welcome to A Culture of Curiosity, a podcast delving into the school experiences of millions of children around the world. This is a curious podcast for educators by educators. And I'm Jack, a belonging and inclusion specialist.
And I'm Maureen, a former head teacher and now leadership coach and SEN specialist. We're talking all things inclusive education, creating a culture of curiosity around situations and dynamics that exist in every school, every day.
So whether you're a teacher, leader, or just passionate about creating schools where every child gets to belong, you've ended up in the right place. Mo, this week we're back. We've made it to episode 2. That means we didn't terrorise episode 1. This is a good thing. And this week we're talking about inclusion in quite a broad sense. We're thinking about, where does inclusion live and breathe? You know, not the sort of noticeable token gestures, but where does it live? Where does it breathe? And where does it kind of sit? Now, this week, we're really lucky. We are joined by a wonderful, wonderful person, a lovely gent called Dan Tresman. Now, Dan, he is the founder and chief executive officer. I like to say that instead of CEO. He's the big boss at Light Years Education, and he's also he's a new trustee, I think, of the National Association of Special Schools, which is really exciting. I can't wait to chat to Dan.
Hi, guys. As Jack Gary kindly said, I'm the founder and CEO of Light Years Education. Very pleased to be here. Very excited to talk about inclusion.
Fantastic. Now, Dan, and obviously Jack, we like to start with a thought tickle every week, which is a question or something to ponder that sort of gets our curiosity flowing, gets us thinking, okay? So can I give you both a thought tickle for this week? It's, if you could have a personal theme tune that played every time you walked into a room, what would it be? And obviously you've got to tell me why. Do you want to go first, Dan?
Yes. Okay, so if I had a theme tune, I think I'm a huge Rocky fan. And I think that I would like to enter a room with, albeit a bit cheesy, but with Eye of the Tiger playing, because I would like to think that I enter with that sort of energy. Not all the time, but I would like to enter a room with that energy.
And you are, of course, a survivor, which, as we all are, who work in specialist settings.
And that grit and determination is very much part of my makeup.
What
Absolutely
I love,
magnificent song. Yeah.
What I love, though, Mo, is because I know Dan and I am very aware of Light Years School, I can vividly picture in my brain the site, the rooms, the children, and what that would look like in real life. And I can't tell you how much I'm enjoying that visual.
How about you, Jack? What would you have?
See, I'm worried that I've absolutely got one in my head, but I'm worried about the why. Now, I don't know the name to this. I wouldn't say that this is a song. I don't know the name to this theme tune. It's from the Muppets. Can I say that? Are we going to get a letter now? It is, and I'll do a live rendition for you. Prepare yourselves, folks. It is the Mana. Do 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 do. I think the reason why is the way that I stim, the way that I process sometimes is through sort of repetitive chunks of music, song, things like that. But the problem is that this has become quite widely known with people that work with me, and they know that it's one of those earworms. It kind of burrows away and it'll drive me nuts all day. So every now and again, my friends will send me a voice note and I'll naively listen to it thinking, oh, this will be fine, this will be nice. And actually what they've sent me is a little voice note going, mana, knowing full well that's me. That's me gone for the rest of the day.
That is a true friend. Here's a little gift for you.
See, I'm worried now that if you didn't know that, Mo or Dan, that I've now just widened the pool of
well, you
of
have
folk
just now
that
broadcast it to the entire world as well. Let's not forget that.
Plus, now every time you walk into the room, Jack, I'm going to be thinking of the same theme tune.
Mo, save us. What's yours? Please let it be better than mine.
Well, it's equally as nonsensical, but it's from very, very long time ago. And I suspect before both of you were born. But The Goon Show, are you familiar with The Goon Show, or Spike Milligan and all that sort of thing? They had a hit. It was in the 50s. This is, and I wasn't born in the 50s. It was
I was
before
going to say, let's caveat that.
Yeah. And it's called the Ying Tong song. Are you familiar with it at all?
I'm not. I think we
Right.
need to insist on a live rendition.
I will give you one. The reason, I'll tell you my why first, and then I'll give you my little rendition. As you know, I was a head teacher of PRUs, APs, and specialist schools all through my career. There was a period of time in the noughties when I got this reputation as being the person to employ if a setting went into special measures and to get them out of special measures. I had a 4.5-year period where I had an Ofsted inspection every term. It was just extremely intense. And, you know, from the process, you get that phone call in the morning telling you that the inspector's that you're having an inspection and that you're going to get a detailed phone call in the afternoon. And I got into this habit, and I don't even know how it happened. But after you get that initial phone call and they put it through to the office, and at that moment, the only people who know that Ofsted are on the line is the person who's put the call through. So I have the call saying when it is, and you have to be really sort of sitting up and really sensible and writing everything down, and your mind's going at 20 miles an hour. And then what I used to do is that after I put the phone down, there's just this glorious moment where you're the only one it's literally the calm before the storm, those few seconds, and you're both nodding with recognition there. And I got into the habit of actually just finding this. I had it saved on YouTube, this song, and just playing it to myself before I went and told everybody else what was going on. And I will give you a rendition now. It just used to go ying dong ying dong ying dong ying dong ying dong lipo, ying dong ying dong ying dong ying dong ying dong lipo. And it was just nonsense. In fact, you know, because it's from the 50s, I had to double check.
I was going to say, do we need to Google this?
No, you're all right. It's because Harry Seacombe used to mispronounce somebody's name. His name was Edgington, and he used to say Edgington. He just used to get it wrong, and that's how the song started. So it didn't have any nefarious origin story. But yes, the Ying Tong song, that would be it.
So thinking back to what we're talking about this week, we're thinking a lot about inclusion. Now, inclusion, I think it's always had a bit of a buzzword to it. It's always been a term that we wanted to be able to say. We want to be able to put, you know, in fancy writing, in a really pretty font on the bottom of our letterhead, the word inclusion or inclusive. Now, and at risk of you know, speaking for you and complimenting you too early on in the podcast, I think inclusion is something that you have done beautifully in the sort of mission around Light Years and what it is that you've created. But to sort of get us started, are you happy to sort of introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about who you are and what you've done and a bit more about Light Years.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background has always been in SEND. I started my teaching career in a SEND school. Back then it was called EBD, now it's social emotional mental health. And I was a PE teacher to begin with, and my passion was sport and passion was teaching. But then sport sort of faded off, and soon I became passionate about these children that needed, you know, support in particular ways, and the amazing progress that they can make, and all of those things that go along with working in a SEND school. So SEND fast became the passion and the overriding sort of ambition and drive. And I kind of went into mainstream school for a little while as the Senko, and then bounced back out into special. So I've been around SEND all my career, really. Became a head teacher of a SEND school, turned a school around from inadequate to good. And then ended up thinking, well, I might want to do this for myself, and I might want to create a school that's really true to my core values. And so took a leap of faith and opened Light Years School, did Light Years Education. And we're now 2 and a bit years into that journey. And it's going really well. It's really exciting.
That is exciting. How brave. Well done. Well done. No, kudos to you, because that's something that I know I don't think I would have ever had the guts to do.
It does take a real leap of faith, and you have to really back yourself, and you have to absorb all of the risk and thrive off it, really, which hopefully I've done. But it's not easy, but it's also awful.
It strikes me as like, to be a head teacher, you have to do that, being the swan and gliding along and all that. But that just sounds like that's weird, actually, to be the proprietor as well.
Yeah, and I was the proprietor and the founding head teacher to begin with. But then the team around me here was at Light Years School, so wonderful, as Jack knows. And so it soon became apparent that the deputy head could step into that head teacher role. So I've stepped into that proprietary role.
I feel like we should tell the world how it is that you and I met, Dan, if that's okay. Now, Dan, do you know, we're about to talk about Team Teach. I'm gonna send them a letter. I think they owe us sponsorship fees. I think. So Dan and I were connected by a very well-known trainer at Team Teach called Mr. Tom Wright. Tom put me and Dan in touch over some training that we wanted to look at. And we met in the August, just before the school opened in the following September. And we had the most lovely 2 days together. And what I loved, it's one of my favourite courses I've ever run, because what we didn't just have was sort of course members fresh to sort of our way of thinking. They were also people that had joined together in this sort of beautiful mission in a team whereby they'd not met each other yet. So not only were they training together, it was the first time they'd really come together as a team. And it was just such a beautiful 2 days. And I completely fell in love with Light Years and the mission and what it was that Dan and his lovely team were looking to create. And just like you and I know, we met, we connected, and we've never been rid of each other since. So I'm now really fortunate that I am chair of governors at Light Years School.
Okay.
So I get to work really closely with the team, really closely with Dan and Sarah, who is head. So let's talk about inclusion as this buzzword. I think we've all experienced this, haven't we? Where we know that inclusion is hot on the radar at the moment. There's a lot of discussion and consideration around it. Maybe later on in the episode, we'll touch on the sort of, suggested new inspection framework. But in terms of inclusion, maybe what does inclusion mean to you, Dan?
I think you're absolutely right. This word inclusion is a real buzzword, but I think it's a good thing. I think it's a really good thing that we're talking about inclusion more and more. We all know that, there's been a huge explosion of SEND need over the last, year on year for the last 10 years, there's increasing need, but especially since COVID, year on year, increased applications for EHCPs, special school placements, all of those things are increasing. So it's really good that people are talking about inclusion all the time. And for me, it is a sense of belonging. It is a sense of being included in a society or in an organisation, or in this sense, in a school. Really what that means is being able to access every aspect and supporting children who are disadvantaged or who have SEND in a way that allows them to do that. Because it is more challenging, and the more diverse needs that we have, schools are challenging places to be. And if we can remove all of those, or not necessarily remove them, but support them so they're accessible, then that is what inclusion is. And that's what we should all be striving towards, really.
I think you're right. And, that it's not just that EHCs are expanding, it's particularly in the areas of social, emotional and mental health needs. And it's just absolutely phenomenal. The number of exclusions, for example, from schools, there's just been a huge, I think it's 34% increase from 2023 to 24 on the previous year. It's actually the complexity and the balance is being shifted. So you would have a challenging situation, but then you'd have periods of respite. But as more and more young people are experiencing social and emotional mental health needs, and I still believe that the pandemic is a massive factor in that. What I've found is that the capacity to cope has just gone down because people are exhausted, because it's just relentless.
And I think that's where, the whole education sector would need to work together to be inclusive, because mainstream schools have a far greater diverse set of needs that they're responding to on a daily basis now compared to maybe 10 years ago. And they have to adapt and they have to do what they can. With high levels of acute need, they can only do so much. So that's where your special schools and your independent special schools and your PRUs and your specialist units, all of those things then come into play. And quite often they're all treated sort of as separate entities, when actually we should be probably saying we are the education world. So let's utilize all of those different aspects when they're needed to create an inclusive education system, far greater than just one isolated school or a group of schools, etc. Now that's very easy to say and probably quite hard to do, but takes a bit of a mind shift in professionals, but also maybe from a regulatory point of view, it creates a mind shift in terms of that.
I think you're right. I think the example that you gave, that, inclusion as a word is quite, predominantly used. And it's great that we're having so many more conversations about inclusion. And it's great that there's such a sort of, commitment to moving towards inclusion, and for that to be lived and breathed by everybody, that sense of belonging. But I think that's the difference, isn't it? That we want to move past belonging and inclusion being something that's offered in sort of silos or, sort of one-track experiences, and something that gets to live and breathe, and something that feels accessible, something that I can reflect on and know that, actually in the environment that I'm supported in, I can access these opportunities. I do get to be myself. I do get to navigate the world in a way that is true to my experience. And nobody's asking me to be something I'm not. And but what we are looking for is, okay, so we're at A, how do we move to B? Let's figure it out together.
It's really simple for me. It's just the idea of inclusion is just doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Do you know what I mean? It's that just simplify it. We do get ourselves bogged down in the complexities of A, B, and C. And actually it's a mindset. And I know that the whole question about this episode is about where does inclusion live, and maybe it lives within your mindset more than it lives within policies or practice. If it doesn't live within your mindset, no amount of policy and practice and everything else is going to have a fundamental deep down impact, in my view.
Couldn't agree more. I think, when I think of inclusion, I think inclusive practice is best done when it's part of the school's DNA, when it's part of absolutely everything that a school does, and not seen as an afterthought, not seen as we've got a specialist unit over there, that's where those type of children go. Well, that's not necessarily an inclusive way of thinking. If that specialist unit is there and embedded within the school, then that's inclusive. So it's just, you can do lots of good things, but if it's not in the DNA, if it's not in, the leadership's vision and core values, then it's not going to be put out across an organisation. And I think that's absolutely critical, really.
That's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because we are seeing, that I think it would be fair to say that in previous years, there's sometimes been a bit of a divide between what we might refer to as a specialist provision or setting and what we refer to as a mainstream setting. And I have encountered, lots of examples of a narrative of, well, that child, that young person doesn't belong here. They're not one of us, that they belong in specialist. And what we should caveat that with is that actually I'm of the firm belief of the right provision for the right young person in the right context. Inclusion, as you said, Maureen, it's about doing the right thing in the right way for that person. But I think sometimes where that narrative has become a concern is this idea that actually certain kinds of inclusion only belong in certain kinds of provision, that you go to this kind of provision to be included, that it just can't be possible here. And when we think of, quite complex need, sometimes that does have to be the reality. But I think in lots of instances where that reality becomes concerning is when the mindset is wrong. When the mindset is, well, this goes here and this goes over there. I think that there's also a conversation here then, isn't there, about what inclusion looks like a sort of education level and how that might sort of work together and as a community approach between the different variety of provisions that exist in any one sort of authority or community.
Yeah, so Dan, I agree with you. And can I turn that into a question for you, Dan? So on a practical level, how did you get that whole school approach? How do you actually create that feeling that Jack's been just sort of highlighted there of having a fundamental understanding of what inclusion is and how it looks in your school on a practical level?
Well, I think true to the core values of light years education is that the child is at the centre of everything. So every decision that we make, the child's at the centre. And lots of schools say that, and lots of schools do this. But when you do that, and that's a genuine statement, you then start to think about all aspects of the school. And if I think about inclusion as I want an inclusive school, so therefore I need to make it accessible, we started to look at the fabric of the building and how that was inclusive. So the building had sort of purple walls in the corridors and blue doors and some green doors and different shades of blue in each of the classrooms. And it was a little bit old just by the nature of the building. But all of those different colours, it was an attack on the senses almost. But what we wanted to do was say, okay, well, let's paint the entire school a really nice, beautiful light grey, something that you might have in your home. And we painted all the doors a slightly darker grey. And so suddenly it went from quite a busy environment in terms of the sort of the colours and things like that to a very calming environment straight away. Then we thought about what furniture we might like and what furniture the children might like to have around. And we thought, well, no one likes sitting on a hard plastic chair all of their days. So we looked at how we might provide sort of soft furnishings. And suddenly we created an environment that was really appealing. And when anyone comes into our school, they talk about how calming it feels and how lovely the classrooms are, you know, we have a sofa and a nice, like a sensory tent. And we worked with a company called TBC Therapy, and they were really fantastic in hearing our vision, sharing the vision with their own vision as well, creating these classrooms that are just really wonderful. So immediately I remember showing children around at the start, and when we showed them around now, the first thing they say is, wow, this looks like my living room. You know, and it's wonderful. And it's just a mindset shift. You know, this company that we work with, they do mainstream schools, they do independent schools, they do special schools. And it was a brave decision, but it was also a decision that we had a blank canvas so we could do it. So I'm not belittling all of the other complications if you're trying to change your existing school into something like that. But we found it was monumental in how people felt about the school. And even when we had our Ofsted inspection, and the Ofsted inspectors talked to our children and said, you know, what's the best thing about this school? Quite a few of them said, oh, we love the chairs. We love the chairs because they're soft and they're inviting. Not the care and attention that the teachers give them or anything like that. It's the chairs, but that's inclusive in itself. You know, that's a wonderful thing.
And that's almost Maslow's hierarchy of needs, isn't it? That basic need. The amount of times when I deliver training, and I actually wrote plastic chairs as you said it, because the amount of times I deliver training and it's to teaching staff, and at the end you can see them, they're struggling so much with just staying seated all day and staying in that one seat. And I just think, well, do you actually go back and equate that to the experience of the young people that you teach? Because how many times do they get admonished for fidgeting in chairs and not being able to sit still and what have you? And could it just be that it's that start point of them not being comfortable because these sitting in those plastic chairs, they've gone numb, you know?
And it went beyond that, really. So we have sensory tents, small wooden tents in the classrooms that children can access should they need to during the class. And in some classes they work and in others they don't. So it's just all child needs led, if you like. But I remember setting it up, and I put the tent over to the left, and the tent was there in case children needed it. And working with TBC Therapy, they came in and they plonked the tent at the back, but right in the centre. And they said, that's different to putting it over to the side, because I put it over to the side, not facing the board. And actually all that does is saying, wonderful, I've got the tent. That's really inclusive in itself. But when that child then needs to access that tent and access that space, they're not included. I put them over to one side, and that might suit them, and that might be good, and it might suit the class because I can carry on teaching. But when we moved it to the centre, they accessed the tent in the same way, but they could access the learning. So they might have just needed to access that different space, but they were still included in what was going on. And I think that was it was a really powerful statement and a really powerful thing to just truly understand what we were trying to do. And so the sofas, they face the board, essentially. So if a child needs to have a moment where they need to just remove themselves slightly, they're still included in the area. Instead of leaving the classroom, they're more inclined to stay in the classroom because they've got different areas that they can access. And when they access those, they can still access the learning. So they're still included in the whole learning environment. And it's a really powerful theoretical argument, but it's also in practice, it really delivers.
Love it. Love it.
One of the things that I think you said right at the beginning, you talked about how every child at light years school or within light years education is at the center of everything that you do. And one of the things that I really appreciate about that, and one of the ways that I think you do it, is part of a conversation I found myself having yesterday with another practitioner, that we spend a lot of time as practitioners and those of us working in education reflecting on what the experience looks like. How does it live and breathe and feel for the young people experiencing it? But sometimes one of the gaps is that we don't always ask. We don't always offer that kind of reflection with the very young people that are experiencing it day in, day out. And I know that one of the ways that you do that is you reflect quite regularly with all the stakeholders that are accessing, light years school, to reflect on their viewpoints, their experiences and their feelings. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, we do that all the time. We can do that through verbal feedback, or we do questionnaires, or we just have conversations with parents or children sort of on handover. And it's just important, I think. Lots of schools do that, and then lots of schools do that really well, and it's wonderful. But then also to then act on that feedback is really important too, and make adaptations and just respond to what the child is saying. And of course, the staff who know the children really, really well. And our classrooms have changed over time. The way that we deliver the curriculum has changed over time through all of that feedback.
A collection of that sounds awful, but data is inclusive in its practice. I know firsthand that the children in school are supported with the adults that are around them to access that process, to really be guided through reflection of what it feels like to go to light years school, the support that they're offered, the teachers that they get to connect and form safe and secure attachments with, and not only to collect that but to reflect on it, I think is really wonderful, because inadvertently often it can be the piece that's missed, I think, of what that really looks like for those that sometimes trudge in on those cold, rainy mornings, that have maybe had a wobbly morning, that don't necessarily want to bolt straight to school at 9 a.m. to think about what does that experience look like for them. And I think that plays into a whole school approach. It's got to consider everybody and everybody's thoughts and feelings.
I think it's right, and really understanding, we have a small school. It's a small school with small class sizes, so it's different for us, and each setting has to think of inclusion in the way that it makes sense for them. That will vary setting to setting, but understanding what's happened to that child on the way to school or the previous times since 3:00 yesterday afternoon, a whole load of things could have happened, and to understand that they're coming back into school the following day, which is wonderful considering what some children might have to respond to. But then we've set up the school day so that the first half an hour is a soft start. They have the ability to choose what breakfast or what snack they might want, and that's toast or cereal. And everything is a predictable environment, so they know that that's the first thing they're going to choose. They're going to pick off their name and put on the Velcro under toast. And we even go as far as to say some children like burnt toast. What I describe as burnt toast, I'm a light dust of crisp personally. So some of the children like that, so they can choose different, because we know children with particular SEND needs, that might be enough to really affect them or make them become deregulated. So it's that sort of level of detail. It's a deliberate decision making throughout every aspect that then allows them to be successful. And obviously that's a little bit easier to do in a small setting, but you still have to be considered. You still have to really, really carefully analyze, okay, what is going on here? How can we make this even more inclusive? And those deliberate decisions, albeit small things, through every aspect of the day, really then do have a huge effect overall.
May I just respectfully challenge one thing, and because I'm guilty of it as well, is that we preface things of, it might be a bit easier for us because we're in a specialist setting, or because we're not mainstream, or because, and I'm coming to the conclusion that we should stop saying that's something that's not particularly accurate, because in terms of relational approach, in terms of doing things that are universal, there's a lot that you can do that actually a whole number of people can benefit from. And generally speaking, in a mainstream school, there are only in your class going to be a few, no more than the ones that we have in our specialist setting. And you get this radar that builds up of, I know when that child needs more than the universal offer of care and consideration and time. And you hone in on those. And it isn't so much that we don't get the time to actually notice those things, because we do notice those things. It's about prioritizing the importance of doing something with that information that we notice about that child. Am I making sense? Do you know what I mean?
You are making sense, and I do completely agree. And I think it then is the mind shift of all individuals within that setting. I do agree with you to a large extent.
It's about having the structure to then do something with that information that you've gleaned in the conversations that you have during form time, however long that form time is. The nuggets that you get, that's something I really need to, you clock when the child needs you to know that information about them. And that's an important thing. And you develop that skill. And I don't think it's just the realm of us in specialist settings to actually develop that skill. And it's recognizing actually it matters whether or not it's Pokemon or Roblox or Minecraft. It matters. I can't just say they like games or they like IT or they like whatever. These things come to represent more than just the game for that child. It's their way of connecting with me.
We become great detectives, don't we? I think regardless of the provision that we work in, we do become great detectives. And we, at risk of plugging the name of our own podcast, we talk about that culture of curiosity, of how do I remain curious? And what does this mean? What does this tell me? What could this lead me to? I wonder where this might take me. But I think you made an interesting point, Mo, that I think we see this quite a lot as when we deliver training, that sometimes the response we get is, oh, well, that wouldn't work for us here. No, we couldn't possibly do that here because we've got more children or because we've got a different layout. And I think what's interesting is sometimes we do get bogged down on the kind of the solution, the answer, and that might not look the same. But how do we translate the experience? You know, whether we're moving from a classroom of 6, 7, 8 young people to a classroom of 23, 4, 5, 30 children, it might look different in its application, but how could we offer a similar experience, and what would it take to get us there?
How do we remain curious? How do we carry that on? I think that's a really good point. Can I just ask you a question, Jan? In terms of your inclusive approach, and keeping curious and keeping reflecting and asking for all that great feedback, how does that feedback and things that you learn from the children, how does that impact on your curriculum? And how do you get inclusion across your school and into that curriculum?
Yeah, I mean, inclusive curriculum is a really, really big topic. And first and foremost, when we design our curriculum, we follow the national curriculum, and we call it an ambitious curriculum. So we still have those really high expectations for our children, and it's still really ambitious for them. We want them to achieve the best that they can achieve. And it's our job, in order to deliver that, we need to adapt the curriculum to meet those individual needs at their individual level. And it's not too dissimilar from your mainstream curriculum in that sense. Or it's almost identical. But what we do is we have a huge emphasis on things like multi-sensory approaches to teaching. So we really think about how can we bring this maths problem to life, for example, and multi-sensory approaches are really essential to that. Things like handwriting, if we're thinking about handwriting, we might start off by drawing letters in kinetic sand, for example, or different in water or something like that, just to sort of engage. And this isn't necessarily specific to autism or social emotional mental health or dyslexia, but they're traits and they're techniques, I suppose, that can be used in all mainstream schools, specialist settings, you know, in all walks of life. But it really brings it to life, and it's just a slightly different way of adapting learning. So, and ultimately what it does is really builds confidence in that child that they're accessing learning again, they're accessing the school again, they're accessing the classroom, and they're starting to learn. And once you sort of transform that approach to how they feel about school, that's when the sense of belonging comes, that's when the relationship comes, and all of those relationships, belonging, they will underpin exactly what inclusion is. So we pride ourselves by saying we really believe in our children, so we don't lower their expectations, but we do know that we then have to adapt, use different approaches to enable them to to access it. So it's all about how can they access school, how can they access this piece of work, and what do we need to do as the educators to really allow them to do that?
I suppose also how they access the wider world as well, isn't it? How do they interact with how do we give them the tools to interact with the wider world? Because at some point they are going to leave us and go into that wider world. So how do you get them ready for that next step then?
Well, we also, alongside our academic curriculum, we also run a Thrive curriculum. And Thrive is just the most wonderful approach to supporting children with their social emotional development. And it's something that I haven't come across until I worked at Light Years Education and the team here. But the Thrive curriculum really dives deep into assessing where they are socially and emotionally. So you might have a child that's sort of, let's say the child's 10 years old, but actually from a social point of view, from an emotional development point of view, they might be at a 3-year-old's capacity. And once you understand that, and once you see that child in that capacity, they might be able to read, they might have a reading age of 13 plus, for example, but actually from a social and emotional point of view, they're operating at a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old. So your whole picture of them and your understanding of their needs changes so that you can pitch work at the right level. You can talk about multisensory approaches. So a 3-year-old might love, I've got a 4-year-old at home and he loves nothing more than Play-Doh, for example. So why don't we create letters and words out of Play-Doh? Because that's what's going to get them engaged. That's what's going to get them confident, rather than trying to say, sit in that plastic chair and do your work. That's you're not going to win that scenario. And the only person that's going to lose out really is the child. So the Thrive curriculum has been monumental in changing how we approach learning to do that. And it's also given those children that need it the right support when they can't access the school or the curriculum, and allowing them to become deregulated, support them in a way that makes them feel safe, secure, so that at some point they can come back whenever they're ready into the school environment and sit down and work. And I think lots of children who come to my setting at that point, at the point of deregulation, they've been saying, okay, well, now we have to go home now, or you have to be working in this room over here because it's impacted on here. And I completely understand that. So I'm not sort of knocking any environment that does that. It's really challenging aspect of education. But what we do is, through the level of staffing, through that multisensory approach, through our ability to keep children safe in their most deregulated scenario, we can bring them back. So they learn gradually, and it might take a long time, it might take a very short time, that this is a safe place. They can come back once they've hit a point of what they might seem as no return. They return, and that has a profound effect on them. Really, you can't underestimate the impact of that. A minute ago I was deregulated, but now I'm back in my classroom, or I'm back in the tent, or I'm back on the sofa, and then in a few minutes time I'm back in my desk. So the ability to do that, and all of that encompasses what we try and do.
That's fantastic, really interesting that. And it's about that idea of what, just to pick up on what you said, that someone becomes deregulated, somebody becomes distressed, and the process that we can fall into is to actually exclude them more by physically removing and keeping away. It can be the length of time, of course, but I think for me, and we talked about this earlier, I think before we started filming, but language and the language that's used around that, it can be, as you say, you're in this room because you've upset other people, but actually that's a very different mindset of, I want to give you a chance to start again. So I need to be sure that you're ready to start again. You see what I mean? And the subtle use of language can really change the mood and change the feeling behind any action, whether you are in mainstream or in specialist settings.
Absolutely. I mean, we're super careful about how we talk to children and what we say in those scenarios. We don't necessarily follow scripts or anything, but it comes back to a culture. We understand the children, we know them very, very well, and we know what's going to work. And it doesn't work all the time. It doesn't work all the time, far from it. But because of that whole school approach, because everything else is inclusive, sort of driven, more inclusion driven, I suppose, it adds up over time.
It's about having that toolbox of activities, toolbox of responses, and getting confident in selecting the one to use in this particular scenario, isn't it? It's not about doing one thing and that working every single time.
I think we're also talking about that view on individual success. I really like the word success. And in my cheesy, language police role, I did a piece of work recently around behaviour policies, and we shifted the language there to a relationship policy and what that looked like behaviourally. And then we had a look at what we meant by behaviour plans or IEPs or whatever term we're using. And I floated this idea of, well, what if we pitch them as success plans, at different moments for that young person throughout the experience that they have with us? What is it that they need, whether skills to develop for themselves when that's right, or support that they need from their peers, support that they need from us as staff? What do they need to be successful, and how do we move forwards? Because we come back to language there, don't we, Mo, where we're thinking about this. This isn't that I'm, removing you from this space because you've done something wrong. Let's take a moment, let's take some time, and how do we go back? How do we make it right? That the plan for me was important, that it was individual. I mean, we've all worked with children where some of them, their success is that they're the first in, they're the last out, they're really engaged, they love to get involved and help, they want to take in everything that school has to offer. For some young people, they will have a wobbly moment through reception where we'll take them somewhere nice, we'll offer them a bite to eat, we'll sit under a parachute for 3/4 of an hour trying to unpick something that went wrong yesterday. And that's success. And both of those experiences deserve to be acknowledged as successful. So the reason that those plans were important to me is, what do you need to have a successful and positive experience? Because that's how we move forward. And it changes thinking, doesn't it?
It's really great that you say that, Jack. And as educators, we're constantly learning. And I remember when we first opened Light Year School a few months in, I rang a parent to give them some feedback on a difficult day that a child had had. And I can't remember exactly how I phrased it, but I was obviously talking and discussing some of the behaviours that we'd seen, and paraphrasing, albeit I wouldn't have said it like this. I said it was essentially, he's had a difficult day. And actually the parent turned around to me and said, Dan, I think he's had a brilliant day. They weren't disagreeing with me. They said the fact that he's got out of bed, he's put on school uniform, he's got in a taxi, which he fears, and he's made it to school. It's monumental what's happened here and what Light Years have been able to do, or not necessarily Light Years, blowing my own trumpet a bit there, but what this school setting had done. So I sort of rang saying it hadn't been successful, essentially. And I was sort of met with no, this is monumental. This is amazing. And yes, it might have been a difficult day somewhat, but it really brought it home to me, even, every day, of what is that success? Just like you said, well, actually, we were really successful today, albeit you may have not felt like it, and we might have had to do some debriefs and bits and pieces, but for that child, that was success. And if you can build on that compared to maybe what has happened before and see it as success, change the mindset and support the child as best you can, then that's a wonderful change of mindset immediately. And it really, I remember that quite vividly, and it's stuck with me since, of what is success and what does inclusive success almost look like, I suppose.
Does that extend to the staff in terms of helping them? Do you phrase it in terms of success for the staff? Because it's a way of helping them actually process what can be quite taxing experiences.
I think we do. I think we're really big on debriefs and supportive conversations, and certainly when a serious incident's happened or any sort of thing like that, then we do get together and we do try and remind ourselves of just how far that child has come since maybe starting. What was it like before and what is it like now? And yes, that was really tricky, and we're going to have to really adapt maybe what we do and think for how we can make the school accessible and so that doesn't happen again. But it is phrasing things like that. So talking about how can we just do some subtle changes here to make this scenario maybe not happen again? How do we make it more accessible? It's not sort of the other way around to say, what are we going to do with this child?
How do we help this child conform to our,
It's like, what can we do? So it's not shying away from the trickiness of it, but it's a conversation, and we do try and as much as we can. It's hard though, because sometimes, working in schools, any type of school, is really draining and it can be incredibly difficult, but we do try to rephrase it and try and think of exactly that.
I call it planting seeds. So I was delivering some sort of follow-up support for a provision that I've known for quite a few years. And they were talking to me that they'd noticed that they were starting to see more confrontation, not necessarily kind of, contact-made physical fights, but more points of confrontation. And we talked about how staff were looking to sort of de-escalate, offer ways forward, and what that looked like. And I asked this question, and honestly, if looks could kill, that would have been me. I asked the question, I said, so we've been able to offer some support. We've managed to kind of pitch our demand possibly correctly. We've offered a way forward. Where do we plant the seed and when do we say thank you? And I was asked the question, what do you mean say thank you? We're talking about young people who are having a bit of a Barney. We're worried that this is going to escalate to a point where someone might get hurt. And you're suggesting that we say thank you when we've managed to sort of prevent that from happening. And I said, absolutely. So I'll give the example that, for some young people, they get stuck in situations that feel outside of their kind of level of autonomy in that situation. For some young people, they've got a safe face. They've got to present themselves in a way that allows them to keep themselves safe. But not always do they find themselves in a situation that truly they choose to be in. So I'm a firm believer, whether it's a physical fight or not, that if we're able to separate that fight safely, that we'll say thank you. And the reason that we do that is we plant the seed that for some young people, the impact of their experience upon reflection can bring about this massive wealth of shame, this real guilt of feeling like they have no choice of how they find themselves in those moments. They don't know what else to do. They wish they could do something or be something different. And if we don't plant seeds, sometimes there's nothing for us to walk that young person back to. So the reason that I thank children in a wobbly moment of confrontation, when I say, thank you for coming with me, thanks for walking with me, let's talk this out, is because that might be the only moment I can bring them back to. That might be the silver lining, the seed that I get to say, but, okay, you didn't make a great decision. You know that, I know that. But when I asked you to listen to me and work with me, you did that. And I'm so pleased that you did. That individual success of how do we move this forward? Yeah, planting seeds. I don't know why that's what I call it. But I think sometimes if we don't plant those seeds, there'll be nothing there to go back to when we need it.
It's that thank you for letting me help you. Thank you for trusting me, because it's a massive thing of trust, isn't it? At your most vulnerable, to decide who are you going to allow in to actually see that vulnerability. You don't realise that actually the whole world can see that vulnerability if they know what they're looking at. But to actually consciously allow somebody to actually come in and be a part of you at your worst, or at your most scared, at your most all those other things, it's a huge trust thing, isn't it?
And it's so, those moments I always found, especially when working in a social emotional mental health setting, it was those moments that were the most powerful, when the child has allowed you. And it doesn't happen by accident, because it's things like you just said, Jack, that strategies, techniques that you utilize in those moments. But when a child has allowed you to be the one that's calmed them down or stopped them from making a decision, that just rings out, big time. It's a wonderful moment, and it sort of goes, you don't talk about it, but you and the child know that you've made that connection between yourselves, and then you are a go-to person for them. And when you arrive on the scene, or when you're in the classroom, or when you're delivering a message or whatever, they hear it, because they've developed that relationship. And I know those moments. I've been in those situations, and really, really precious and really wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of talk at the moment about big systemic change at Ofsted at that sort of inspectorate level. And I think that conversation around, reform is welcomed. We know that, there is a requirement to make sure that the provision that we offer in any capacity is the very best that it can be. I don't think anybody working in education would dispute that. But the big kind of topic being discussed at the moment is the consideration that Ofsted in their sort of inspection framework are likely to look at some kind of view around inclusion. Now, I'm not asking this question to hold anybody to their political views or anything scary like that. We can't get cancelled on episode 2. But what are our thoughts and feelings on that? What do we think that could look like if it was to be done appropriately with the best intentions at heart?
I mean, I've read the proposals, as we all have, and I'm pleased to see that inclusion is one of those aspects. So that's a real positive step, I think. I think what has to be considered is that when looking at inclusion as one of those 12 things, or however many they're looking at, that it's not looked at in isolation. Otherwise, it might become, or it's vulnerable to become, sort of, we do X, Y, and Z for our SEND children. We do X, Y, and Z for our disadvantaged children. And that makes us an inclusive setting, because that could be fundamentally untrue. They could do all of those things, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have a culture of inclusivity. And I think, so as much as it's a positive step that it's there, I think we probably just need to be slightly aware that actually that doesn't necessarily make you an inclusive school. And I just, I would have loved to have seen sort of schools and guidance and, still in consultation phase. So you can also give this feedback, but sort of schools being recognized for how inclusive they are. Not that it's simply a sort of tick box exercise, but sort of saying, not necessarily rewarded, because I think all schools should be there, but recognised for the level of need that's in their school. Because I know of stories where schools have been absolutely wonderful places, really having such a wonderful sort of outlook on inclusion, very supportive of SEND children. But when it came to look at their attendance data that was slightly below average, that meant the difference between good and outstanding. Well, hang on a second. This school is truly outstanding, because look at what they're doing for children that need a high level of support. But you can't say that's really good and then say, actually, well, your attendance isn't very good, or it's a few percent below national average, and therefore you cannot be outstanding. Well, that's where the mind shift has to happen. And it has to happen from a regulatory point of view, because ultimately school leaders are held to account by their Ofsted inspections. And that's just the way it is. And yes, we don't do stuff for Ofsted all the time, but we also have the framework there that, we adhere to. And when that's done really well, then it's really wonderful. So I'm not saying school leaders do stuff for Ofsted, but when it comes in and Ofsted make a judgment along those sort of lines, for example, then how are we supposed to achieve this mind shift into a really, truly inclusive society when actually someone comes along and says, well done for doing all of that, but we can't possibly give you the highest grade here, or, a decent grade, or whatever it might be, because your attendance is low. Well, actually that school might have, 50% disadvantaged children. It might have a way well above average pupil premium cohort. It might have high levels of SEND that really impact on those things. And I would like something in that framework to say, really well done. That is absolutely amazing. As long as it is being done really well, then wow, you guys are absolutely amazing. And you've achieved this, attendance level or behaviour level with all of that need in. Well done. This is beautiful. This is amazing.
I've heard two things from you there, Dan, and I think that you're absolutely right. One is the risk or the threat that as soon as, and you're absolutely right, you have to have that regulatory body there. But the threat that comes with that is anything they write down in their descriptors, anything they write down in that framework is open to become latched upon as the key thing or the buzzword or the key focus. And I know that there's been a lot of very, and rightly, focus on attendance. And my fear is that attendance will become the mechanism by which everything else will be measured, which is what you've said as well. But also it's that idea of, in terms of inclusion itself, and I'll be honest, I actually have responded, and I put this in my response. I wish that the word belonging was being used more than inclusion in some respects, because it doesn't necessarily mean a special educational need. It doesn't necessarily mean an adaptive approach. Inclusion, or its opposite, feeling excluded and feeling that you don't belong, can be generated in nothing more than, for example, looking at the school staff lineup and not seeing anybody that reflects your reality in any way. As a black female, if all of the senior leaders are white males and there isn't any reference to my reality, I don't feel as included. It doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be, obviously, we're going down an awful line if we say we start talking about quotas, But actually belonging can be as fundamental as that, can't it? And that's taking inclusion, I think, to its natural conclusion.
I think you're absolutely right. I think, and this is the tricky bit, isn't it? Of what would the metric look like? And I think that's the big question we're all asking is what is it that might look to be measured? Because a lot of what we're talking about might not be evidenced in sort of, cold data that can be analysed or responded to, that actually there's a lot of individual feeling and expression of that feeling as to how that lives and breathes. And for us, we kind of get to do that in our provisions because our finger remains on the pulse. We live it and breathe it too. But as a kind of spot inspection for however long inspectors join us for, that is the big question, isn't it? Of what is it that they go looking for, and how would they find it, and how would it be recorded? So I think it's great that people are still responding to that consultation.
I did see some really positive things in there, SEND and disadvantaged children and things like that. They were mentioned in other aspects of it, through the curriculum, especially around progress. There was something that SEND children make progress from their individual starting points, which is something that we're really big on in our setting, because actually a child might come in at X and that's their starting point. And we sort of throw the age-related expectations sort of out the window and say, yes, well, maybe not completely out the window. They're still there, but we can't talk about that year 5 or year 7 or year 9 or whatever age-related expectations, because we're working at year 1 over here. So we start from those individual starter points. But that seemed to be mentioned in the school inspection handbook from individual starting points. So I think when you look at the content of the other aspects, it seems that there might be a shift, which is really, really positive. If that then becomes the reality, then I think, every setting is going to benefit from that as well. So I'm quite hopeful.
Optimistic, yeah.
I don't necessarily think the report card is any different from the 4 areas of need and the judgment. So there's some things that aren't so good, but I think
it's just going to be harder to create those plastic signs and banners outside that's what it is.
What will we drag over the school by aeroplane?
So thank you so much for that, Dan. And some really, really interesting points there. I think we've come to the end of our session today. But before we go, just one really, really quick question. What's next for Light Years Education? What are your plans moving forward?
Well, it's been a pleasure to be part of this podcast, so thank you very much. And our plans, we're continuing to grow the school, and we'll grow it to capacity, keep on meeting the needs of those wonderful children that we have. We have some plans for maybe some expansion in the future, but we'll see what happens in that regard. But yeah, we'll just continue to do what we do to do best and meet those needs of those children.
Oh, right. So we'll be watching this space then, Dan.